Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me okay. Is that everything's good? Brilliant. Okay, so as Meg said, my name's Mark, and I'm here today to talk to you about how we've gone about tackling the problem of syndicating content between WordPress websites. So I've been using WordPress for quite a long time, but I'll tell you a bit more about me at the end. I'm sure you want to know more about this talk, so let's get straight into it. This is a work in progress. It's not perfect, it's not finished. But it's certainly the process of how we've done it is probably worth sharing with you. Here we go. So, before we start looking at what this is, I suppose it's a good idea to define what content syndication actually means. Do you understand what we mean by the concept of syndicating content? So I did what you tend to do, is I had a look online. This clicker's a bit dodgy. To try and find some definitions, and came up with this definition, which says it's the act of syndicating content or syndicating a news feature by publishing it to multiple websites, newspapers simultaneously. So that's more of a print definition of how maybe something happened. Maybe that's like a journalist writes an article and it ends up in a national newspaper, a local newspaper, so on. So that's kind of what the sort of print definition might be. So in terms of the web and in WordPress, we might change that definition slightly to be something more like this. So the act of syndicating a post by publishing it to multiple websites simultaneously. So it's the concept that someone writes a piece of content, a post, a page, whatever it is in WordPress, and then we can make that content available on multiple different websites for whatever reason that might be. So that's what we mean by syndicating content, or that's what we mean by syndicating content anyway. Now, I've called the talk Syndicating Content. Internally in this project, we refer to it as content deployment because we're taking some content and we're deploying it to another website. So if I stop using the word syndication in this talk and start talking about deployment, that is actually what I mean. So that's just something I might do and you might need to be aware of. You might think I'm not talking about what the actual talk's about. But that's just like the definition of the terminology we use in the project. So there. So let's dive in to have a bit of a look about the actual project that we did and what it was all about. So back in a few years ago now, we got in touch, or the TUMD, the outsourced marketing department, got in touch with us. They wanted to build a new system. Now they are one of the leading providers of marketing services to the financial services industry. In particular, to IFAs, or individual financial advisors. And they came to us wanting to build a new system that would allow them to send content that they've written to the different websites, the different individual financial advisors, IFAs. So let's have a little bit of a look at the project requirements that came to us. Now, the content deployment or syndication was actually a part of a bigger project. So we will talk obviously more about that in this talk. But these were the list of requirements that they wanted to try and achieve as the whole project. So they wanted to be able to offer IFAs and other financial services businesses low-cost websites that they could spin up quickly and then they could add their content to. They wanted them to have different levels of functionality so that we could build different features for different price points. And that might be that in terms of the content that they receive, the types of content, but it might also be the functionality of the website in terms of what that site can do. They wanted them to have different design options, so different themes, for example, that they can pick from to have a different look and feel. And then different options within those themes to be able to customize them with their brands, their logos, etc. And then the next one is kind of an important one. So when you're dealing with the financial services industry, any content that you write about a financial services product needs to be compliance checked so that it is obviously valid in terms of the rules and regulations. And that's the big thing that TUMD can sell, is that the content that they provide to the websites is compliance checked. So as an IFA, you're receiving that content, you know that you're covered, if you like. And we need to build a process for checking that content when it's written. So can it go through a process of being compliance checked so that it's, once it's written, it's been checked by someone, and then edits might need to be made to it, etc. And then it can be signed off, ready for sending off to the different clients that want to receive it. And then the bit here is the syndication. So then we want to deploy this content to multiple WordPress websites. Each of the IFAs will have their own website. We need to get that content that we've written, whatever it's about, to their site. When they receive that content, they can't edit it. They can't edit it. So it needs to be locked down. They need to be able to control that content. They need to be able to say, I want to show it on my website, or I want to hide it for a while. Maybe they're not quite ready to launch that service or something. So they need to have control of it in that way, but they can't edit it. If they edit it, then it will break the compliance check, for example. So there's issues around that. And the last but not least, it needs to be quick to build a new site. So, you know, we're not talking about weeks here, we're talking about a day or so maybe to build a site quickly for someone and get something up and running. So that's the bigger picture of what we were working with. But like I said, today's talk's a bit in bold mainly. So how do we go about doing this? We utilised something called WordPress multi-site. So if you've not come across WordPress multi-site before, I'd highly recommend you have a look at it. It is an awesome piece of kit. It is just WordPress, but with some bells and whistles activated. And it allows you to create a network of websites, all running WordPress and all running the same installation of WordPress. So rather than having several installations and several instances of WordPress that you have to keep up to date, everything runs off one install of WordPress with the same plugins and the same themes and the same code base. So the way it works is you kind of have a primary site, which is like where you install WordPress and you set it all up. And then below that, you can have lots and lots of subsites. And you can have lots and lots and lots of subsites, which is ideal for this particular project because they do have a lot of websites. In fact, there's over 1,000 sites running in these networks that have got this content delivered to them. Each of those sites can have their own domain name, so they don't have to rely on like a subdomain of the main site, although they can if they want to, but they can have a completely custom domain that they need. So we use multi-site to set up the system so that they could create these network of sites, create sites quickly, and deploy content to them. So let's have a look at the crux of the matter then. The content deployment or syndication process, how does it sort of work? And I've tried to explain this with a diagram. So the green area at the top is like the primary site in the WordPress multi-site network. And that is where our client writes their content. So when they want to write a new piece of content that they need to go through that process of being compliance checked and then eventually getting delivered to their other client sites, they write it in the top site. That's where it gets written. It's just a pretty standard WordPress site. It's got posts and pages and some custom post types that they can deliver down. But they write it up there. It goes through the process of being compliance checked, and once it's marked for ready to be checked or ready to be compliant, then it's available to distribute further down the chain. And then in the blue bit is where we have all the sort of the IFA's websites. Again, there's lots of them in here. And the flow of information goes from top to bottom. So I can send a piece of content down the chain to a specific site. I can send it to a group of sites, and they'll all receive that content. But that information can't go back up the tree. So it's a one-way process going down. So you're probably saying, well, what happens if I've done a spelling mistake in that piece of content? How do I fix that problem? Well, you can update the content in the same way. So once I've delivered the content down the tree, the top bit knows where it is in the bottom bit. So when I want to send it an update again, I can update the same content again. Because something might have changed in regulation, for example, and something needs to change as well, not just for things like errors. And I can also delete it as well. So I can say, delete this content on this person's website or this particular website. I can send that delete command and it will remove it. So that's how it sort of works in terms of its architecture. So we essentially built this with two plugins. We called them content deployment and deployed content. Probably really bad names because they're kind of quite similar. It made sense at the time, trust me. But so these two plugins, one of them goes on the destination site, and then one of them sits on where you write the content. So the deployed content plugin sits on the IFA's website. That's the bit that receives the content and takes delivery of that content and processes it when it arrives. And the content deployment plugin sits on that top level of site that does all the functionality of actually delivering that data down the chain. So let's have a quick look at the sort of settings for each plugin. So this is the settings screen for the plugin that sits on an IFA's website, an individual financial advisor that wants to receive the content. So what they can do is they can set up the deployment URL. So that the top three bits are kind of very specific to our project. So the deployment URL is basically where they're getting their content from, and because it actually comes from a few different places with this particular client. But in broad sense, you wouldn't really need that because it's always going to come from that master site at the top. Then what they can do is we added a box that would allow them to just stop content being delivered to their website if for some reason they want to pause and not have any content delivered. It's also quite good for debugging as well. And then below that, they've got options for the different types of content that they can have on their site. So in this instance, this particular site has posts pages and a post type called services. And this screen allows them to set what happens to that content when it gets delivered to their site. So this person's decided that when a post gets delivered, they want it to be marked as draft. When a page gets delivered, they want it to be published. And when a service gets delivered, they want it to be draft. And that means that they've got the choice of whether that's immediately published on their website or whether they get the chance to go in and have a look at it before they press the publish button. So that gives them the control over that. They can then set which author they want to be the author of that content when it arrives. So in this case, it's me, WP Mark, and they can just choose that from a drop-down of the authors on the website. And then if they want to receive a notification when they've got new content, when it's being pushed down to their site, you can put an email address in, and they can even set up a little custom message to say that content's being delivered if they want to do that. Particularly if they want it to be in draft, because they wouldn't see it on their site until they actually log into their website and they'd see it in the list and so on. But that's quite handy, they can get a notification. And we've tried to build this nice and extensively, so in the future it might be that we can add another notification system, like they can ping a Slack channel or add a Trello card or do something like that. That might be something they want to look at in the future. So then on the top level site where we send the content from, we have a couple of things. So this is where we add a site to the system. So we say, we need to add a site to send this content to. So this is just a custom post type called sites or site. And we're going to add a site. This gives us a destination to send content to. So we just put in the URL, like where it's going to go to, and then we can set, again, this is very specific to this client, but we can set what they're allowed to send. So we can say, this particular site can have only posts, or it can have only pages, or it can have all of them, or it can only have posts from this category. And then we can create a little plan as well, so we can reuse that plan on other sites, so we don't have to tick all those boxes every time. That's a little bit work in progress, is that, but it's working well so far. So this is the site that sends the content, as I mentioned. Bear with me a second. My notes have disappeared. Yeah, so that's just a custom post type. And we've also got on the right-hand side, you can see there's some custom taxonomies, which allow you to group sites into different groups. So in this instance, we've got networks, groups, and build stages. So this client wanted to have sort of like a build stage where we could say this has been, it's been set up or it's been installed, it needs the theme building, it's waiting for its DNS to change, so that they could give a quick indication of where they were in the stage of the builds. So we could quickly do a query to say how many sites have we got that are waiting for this particular stage to happen. And like I said, they're just custom taxonomies that you create and that groups the sites together. And that also allows us to say for a piece of content, let's send it to all the sites within this particular network or all the sites in this group, etc. And then this is how you actually deploy a post. So as you can see, this is just on the post edit screen. We've got this extra box at the bottom here. You can search for the site that you want to do up here. So you can either search for its name or you can use one of the drop-downs to query the sites by a particular group. And then you get a list of sites. These are just some dummy ones that I've on a test environment. You can then add individual sites by clicking here. You can then also remove those once they get added. So if it starts again, I'll show you. So once you do the search, you can click an individual site to add it, and it pops it over on the list to deploy to, or you can remove it, or you can just add the whole lot. And then you can choose what you're going to do with that. So are you adding or updating the content, or do you want to delete it? And then it will run through the sites and tell you what's happening in terms of like whether it's passed or failed. So the ones in red have got an incorrect URL, so it's trying to hit a URL that doesn't exist to try and send it to, just to test whether it works or not. And that's how it's kind of deploys. One thing we did find was we have to change all these queries on here to do sort of like an Ajax-style query in the page. We originally had it running the queries, getting a list of all the sites in the background, and it was really slow because there was quite a lot of sites. So we've improved it a little bit on that as well. Similarly with the deploy, it kept falling over when you're sending it to a lot of sites. I think they run out of memory and things. So we do this in sort of like one at a time now, and then it reports back, which is much more efficient. So how does this work in the background? It uses REST API endpoints to send the data backwards and forwards between the sites. If you've not used the REST API or you've not had a play with it, it's pretty good for this. So an endpoint is registered, which basically returns some data, depending on what you pass to the endpoint. So we could say, for the sites query, for example, on the right-hand side, it's sort of doing a little query that's saying, get me all the sites from this network, and then our endpoint returns the data for those sites. It might just return an array of IDs of all the sites that you've returned. But this is how you register a new endpoint in WordPress. So we use this register REST root function, which takes a namespace and a version. So the namespace is HD content deployment, and it's version 1. So we could change it to version 2 in the future, and it wouldn't break. And then it's got the name of it. So in this case, it's deploy. That's what the URL will be in the URL. We say what methods does it support. So it supports the get methods. And then what's the callback function? So when someone actually hits that endpoint, what function do you want to run that will actually do the processing and getting the data? So in this case, it's going to do the sites endpoint, which is going to run and return a list of sites. And it returns that data in a JSON format, which you're probably familiar with. That's what the REST API does all that for you. You don't need to do anything about that. So when we're doing a deployment, we're going to gather all the data about the post. So the post title, the description, the content, all the metadata and taxonomies, things like that. And we're also going to gather the information about what the site it's been sent to, and then we're going to run that request. It's going to send the data to that site, and then that site's going to have an endpoint that processes that JSON information and turns it into a post. So that's a quick screenshot of the deployment zoomed in version as I showed you. So basically when we hit this blue button in the corner, this is the sort of like the action to deploy site. So send stuff to the sites that you've listed. That's when we sort of do that process and we gather the post information and then it gets delivered to each one of those sites in turn. And then that reports back a success or a failure and why it's obviously success or failed. So that's kind of how that works. So what happens when that actually takes place? So this is kind of how we process a deployment, the sort of checks we go through on the client side that's receiving the content. So we check, first of all, the authentication. So are they logged in? Are they the right sort of user? Are they allowed to do this? We then check whether the post already exists. So if the post already exists, if it's already been deployed at some point in time, then we know we're now updating a post. We're not adding a new post. And the way we know that is because we store the post ID of where it came from. So we can query on the site we're currently on, where it's been sent to. We can say, can you find a post on this site that has this post ID that's come from the top level? If we can, then we know it's already been deployed. If we can't, then we know it's going to be a new post. Once we know whether we're updating it or we're adding it, we can then either do that, insert it or update it. And that just uses the built-in WordPress functions, WP insert post and WP update post. Or even whether we're deleting it, and then it'll be a WP delete post. We can run that on there. Once we've done that, obviously if we're deleting it, we don't need to do the bits at the bottom. But if we're updating it or adding it, we can then run through the taxonomies that are associated with the post and the terms. We can loop through each of those and add those to the post. If they don't exist as a term on the destination site, we'll create it first, then we'll assign it to the post. And the same with metadata. So we'll run through all of the metadata that's attached to the post, and we'll assign that, save that against the new post that's been created, or the one that's been updated. And then, as I mentioned before, we need to store the data about where it's come from. So there's a connection between the site at the bottom and the top level where it's come from. So we know the URL that it came from, and we know the ID of the post that it came from. So we've got that connection, so we can track the changes that are happening. And then last but not least, we store a deployment entry, just a record that a deployment was made at this point in time. That just uses another custom post type to store those in, and it tells us that it was sent on this date and this time by this user from here to here. So we've got a record of what's happened. So that's kind of the process that we go through. And obviously there's quite a bit of code behind how that all works, but that's kind of the flow. Now, when the content arrives on the IFA's website, we said that it was locked down. So the content actually appears just in the normal post listing. So if this particular client had already written a lot of posts, they would just see all the posts in the same place. But the deployed content posts are locked, so you can see that they are black. You can't click on them to edit them. Now, if you've ever logged into a site, I think it's as a contributor. So a contributor can write their own posts that are then pending. And they can actually see all the other posts in the back end, but they can't edit them just in the same way. So this looks the same screen almost that you get if you were that sort of user level. And what we also do is we have a taxonomy called content source, and these get set as a term called deployed. So we can easily find out whether a piece of content is deployed or not, or whether it's a local piece of content. Because it's a taxonomy, we can also easily query and say, get me all the deployed posts in this website and things like that, which is quite handy. And also the client can do that. So it isn't shown on this screen, but I'm pretty certain we've got a drop down up here that says like filter by the deployed content. And I think also if they click on one of these, it'll list all the deployed content or the posts in this instance. What we did is to build this little feature in so that they can change the format of the status of the post. So they can toggle it between setting it to draft and publishing. So if it's arrived as a draft, then they can obviously publish it, and if it's arrived as published, they might want to set it as a draft. Notice they can't delete it, they can only hide it. If they delete it here, then the top level site doesn't know they've deleted it, so we need to do it from the top level site. And this was how we stopped them from editing the posts. So we used a filter called map meta cap. What this function essentially does is to say if we have a post object when this filter is running, is this post object deployed content? If it is deployed content, then just return a do not allow array, and it basically stops them editing that particular piece of content. There might be a better way to do it, but that's how it works. It seems to work well. So, on to the biggie. Media. How do we handle media in a deployed system? So, the essential answer is we don't really. We reference it all from the main site. So when a piece of content gets delivered down the chain, it will have a URL for the images, for example, and that URL will be its reference on the main site that it came from, and that's where we serve the image from. And what we looked at is how to sort of offload that media, because obviously that top site ends up getting a lot of traffic because it gets a lot of requests for all that media from the thousands of sites underneath. So we found this plugin from Delicious Brains. It's called WP Offload Media, and it allows you to offload assets to like a CDN, something like an S3 bucket, and then putting a CDN on it and so forth. It's a little bit complicated, but we got it set up and it's working okay. The block editor does change this quite a bit though, because the block editor obviously sometimes doesn't have the image URL in. It has an image ID. So we're currently looking at ways to solve that with other endpoints. So if we know a piece of content is deployed, we could then query an endpoint on the original site that says return me the URL of this image, so on. So we're getting there. It's coming along. But yeah, media can be a bit tricky, but it is working. It is working. Things like videos, they tend to be fine because they're just obviously most likely to be like things from YouTube or Vimeo, and they're just embedded and they kind of work quite well. So, Just some other notable functionality that we've sort of added to this system, which might be of interest. So we've built in, or we're currently building in, some site image packs. So essentially, so that all of these websites don't have the same images on them, a client can install an image pack on their site, and it will swap out an image for one that's in their pack rather than the one that's being deployed. It allows them to create a pack of images that are better for their brand and their sort of style of business rather than all of the same. We're looking to do campaign monitor integration so that they can do email campaigns for the content that gets delivered to their sites. Also social media stuff so that they can post links to that content through social media, all directly from within the WordPress dashboard area. So really trying to make it more of a marketing sort of platform. And then we've talked briefly about the publishing workflow, so allowing people to mark things as compliance checked and not and so on. And that's kind of has a bit more work to do on it, but it's going quite well. And then a few statistics. So as I said, they've got over 1,000 sites running on this network or receiving content. And about, this is a bit of an estimated guess because I couldn't really get exact numbers, but there's about 40,000-ish posts that have been delivered in this particular way and then sent down that tree. So yeah, it's kind of working well. Got some work to do on it, but it's going quite well. And that's me. Said I'm Mark. I've been using WordPress for, since about 2005, a long time. Although I think it was version 2. I used to be a secondary school teacher. As Meg said in my introduction, that's how I kind of found WordPress. I'm currently a co-founder and director at High Rise Digital. We're a small team of 3 WordPress development agency. I primarily focus on back-end development. Other members of the team do the front-end stuff. And it'd be great if you want to follow me. I am WP Mark on Twitter. We are at High Rise Digital, and there's our URL. And if you haven't seen our little Wapoo game, I suggest you have a play of that. You might have seen it out on Twitter, so give it a play. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you very much, Mark. Quick question from me, actually.
Yes.
Are there any other industries where this content deployment would work well?
Good question. Anywhere where you've got multiple websites that may need the same or similar content. So obviously the first few slides we had was about the news publishing industries. I think they would probably work well for them. Sites where you've got maybe franchisees, where you've got separate sites which need similar services particularly, and then some form of customization for maybe a local site for that person. Intranets probably, maybe, depending on, but yeah, lots of ones you could fit to, I think.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Mark? Oh, lots. Okay, I'm going to come down there because we need the microphone for the sound.
As it says on the slide, it's not necessarily the answers. To thank Ross for that slide, it was a good job of him.
Hi, Mark. Good presentation.
Hello.
Just a question around duplicate content and SEO.
Yep.
I guess you're using some sort of the canonical tag. Are you automating that? And where's the how do you define the master or the source?
Okay, good question. So the normal solution to this is to use a canonical tag. So if you don't know what that means, it sends the sort of the Google juice back to the canonical source of this that you sent it from. Now in this instance, we don't have a canonical source because that master site at the top where we write all the content, it doesn't have a website as such. So we can't really use the canonical URL. So there's 2 options really, and that is to no index those pages so that Google doesn't pick them up as indexed, or do nothing, essentially. So what we've done is we're going to no index those pages that have been served as content deployment, and that depends on your sites essentially that you're delivering the content to. So in this instance, the sites that we're delivering this to, they are mainly local IFA firms. So the actual content that we deliver is not the important bit for SEO. The important bit for SEO is probably their homepage of their website, their about page, their contact page, or other sort of more pages that are to do with that firm specifically than this content. And that's what we encourage they get indexed. So, but yeah, it is a bit of a problem, but agreed, yeah.
Next question.
Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Thanks for your presentation. Just a quick question. You may have answered it already, but What happens when you don't get the URL correct, or you've made a slight error in the URL that you're deploying to those different sites? Will the sites receiving the information or the content, will they somehow manage to slot it in the right place, or will it just sit in the CMS?
So you mean when we send the content, if the top level site doesn't know where it's going properly?
Yeah, or there's some glitch in the URL.
So essentially it won't work because remember the site you're sending the content to needs to have the right plugin installed on it to be able to do that. And it would obviously return like a 404 error to say that page doesn't exist. And then our system would know that that's not worked. And then that's where you saw the X on the ones that didn't work. So that person, you'd know as a user that deployment hasn't worked for whatever reason. What I want to do is to make that error obvious on that screen, which at the moment, it does get reported back as to why it hasn't happened, but I haven't actually put that on the UI, if you like, to tell the user, i.e., we couldn't find the URL, or the post couldn't be added for whatever reason, or something like that. Or maybe the post type that you're trying to add wasn't available on the site you sent it to. So there's work to do on that, absolutely, but yeah, it would fail.
I think we have time for one more question.
So maybe I missed this, but are you making those 2 plugins available for sharing?
I don't think so, because they're very specific to our client. However, the good news is that 10up, one of the large WordPress agencies, they actually have a plugin, I think it's open source, I think it's called Distributor, and it does do a similar thing to what we've done. In fact, I think it's, I can't remember the chap, is it Jake? He did tweet me actually and say, have you seen our plugin, when I was sort of tweeting about this. So, and I had seen our plugin, but obviously we started this quite a while ago. I'm not sure whether it was around when we started this. So, but yeah, ours is very specific to this client as well, I think, and there's that sort of thing. But if you do want to have a look at something, then go and have a look at that. I'm sure it's really good.
There's another one called Broadcast that's very similar.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for all the questions and for the answers, Mark. If anyone has any other questions, you can meet Mark in the Happiness Bar downstairs, which is in this same building. Again, please thank Mark for his fantastic talk.
Thank you.